It's pretty well known that across all forms of spirituality, there are these unifying concepts. And one of the ones that I find to be the most interesting, and perhaps for many people it is the most off-putting or perhaps esoteric, is that they all use and rely heavily on symbolism. This is something that we just take as a given these days, but no one ever asks, why is that? Why can't they just put it in plain English or whatever language it's written in? Why can't they just state simply exactly what needs to be said? If you are a Christian, this figure of Christ almost exclusively spoke in parables. It was always some sort of symbolic, perhaps even cryptic form of communication. And there are all of these theologians, all of these scholars of these religions that make it their life's work to interpret and try and figure out what's going on with all of this esoteric language, all of these symbols. But why is it like that in the first place? If you are depending on this information for your quote unquote salvation, shouldn't it be as simple as possible? Well, it already is as simple as possible. That's why it's wrapped up in all of this symbology. But the underlying principle or the underlying reasons why it's this way, it's pretty far out and trippy. And I appear to have a talent for taking these borderline schizophrenic topics and translating them for normal people. So this is what I'm going to do in this video. This all deals with frequencies. If that word makes you uncomfortable, I know there's a stigma associated with it. You can use the term pattern. If that word makes you feel a bit schizophrenic, you can try information. These three terms are all pointing to the same thing. I talk about this in greater detail in one of my recent videos, which I'll have on the screen. Once you see that reality is frequency, it is pattern, it is information, at the very least, this is the only way we can interpret it or interface with it, then you can begin to understand symbolism. Reality is made up of all of this information or pattern, but obviously it isn't just one single pattern. At least that's not how we interpret it or experience it. It is this ecology of patterns. There are all of these different types of patterns. You can take something as simple as your heartbeat. You can see someone's heart beating. You can feel it beating. You can hear it. This one thing is emitting all of these different patterns or frequencies or information, however you choose to phrase it. These are just examples of sensory patterns, using your eyes and ears to interpret reality. But there are a wide array of patterns that lie beyond our senses, and it is very difficult to translate just how many different types of patterns there are, the wide variety, the different levels, and what a symbol is, it is language. It is a pattern that has been condensed and assigned some sort of distinct utility or meaning. A prime example of this is, what you encounter in algebra when you're first learning math, that you can take Johnny going to the Apple store and buying apples and represent that with an X, some sort of symbol. And doing this allows us to compress information, because that's what a symbol is, as I mentioned. And we have this wild, uncanny ability to do this as human beings, and this is why we have the most sophisticated forms of communication. I mean, look at how different we are from everything else on this planet. Symbols are our fundamental building blocks of how we sort of interpret reality. There are all of these patterns or all of this information that we place into symbols. This is essentially how we see everything. And this operates at such a baseline fundamental level that the further down to the bottom you go, we sort of don't even notice it. It's something that is just on autopilot. Even this language that I'm using to speak to you right now, you just hear it and instantly know what I'm talking about. But you're not thinking about the letters that I'm using and what they represent. But all language is made up of letters, and these letters are symbols that is placed over some sort of information, usually a sound. Spoken language or written language is a perfect way of demonstrating what I mean when I talk about these symbols and condensed information, that if you just have a sound, a vibrational pattern or frequency that you make with your mouth, you put a symbol over that. You could call it A. You develop an entire alphabet of these symbols of condensed information. Then you can arrange these letters in a way that they form unique, distinct words. You can put all of these words in different patterns. You could put all of the sentences that these words make in different patterns. And by the end of it, you have all of this condensed information. It is information that is within information that is within information. You don't say, hand me that thing that I put on my legs to keep them dry and warm. You just say, hand me my pants, because pants is a symbol that is placed over all of this condensed information. And you can probably see and extrapolate that. You can, sort of like the toy, the Russian doll, you can stack these symbols up. You can sort of make a super symbol or some sort of superstructure with them. We see people who do this. They are considered to have some sort of prowess, some sort of skill at something. We see it with poetry. We see it with music, literature, movies. It's called a double entendre, a triple entendre. It's something that has a meaning within a meaning within a meaning. It's like a pun that is within a pun, that you have to have some sort of high level of interpretation to sort of understand what they're getting at. Hopefully you can see how this plays a part in this symbology that's used in spiritual practice. But this doesn't quite paint the totality of the picture. This is where things get a lot trippier and more far out. It's really difficult, as I mentioned, to translate or to make an impression on just how many different types of patterns that there are. I don't want you to approach this or think about these patterns as some sort of flat dynamic. There are levels to this whole thing, this whole kit and caboodle, that really aren't humanly languageable. I mean, that's why there are all of these symbols, but we're going to get to that. There is a huge amount of information that we can't see. I would argue and say that most information we can't see. And when I use this word see, I mean perceive, not as in see with your eyes. There are all of these different patterns, different types of patterns, different scales of patterns that we just cannot perceive. And this may or may not have anything to do with scientific aspects of it. There are patterns of human behavior. You can go to any street corner and see an alcoholic who doesn't see how his alcohol abuse is ruining his life, how that pattern of behavior is affecting him and everyone else around him. Why is it that if your girlfriend or boyfriend is cheating on you, you don't see the signs until after you find out? Once you finally find out, then all of the other previous patterns of behavior begin to make sense. And you just think that, how couldn't I have seen it sooner? It's because it was simply information that you couldn't see. You lacked a perspective to give it any sort of meaning. There is all of this information that we are embedded in that we just simply don't see. But then there is information we are embedded in that we cannot see. There is a major distinction there. Just imagine if you came across some sort of floating brain that only had eyes and ears. How would you explain to it what a hamburger tastes like? What a lemon tastes like? Words such as sour, bitter, they literally have no meaning to it. Those are just empty symbols. If you and this brain were just walking around in the forest, or it would be floating, or however it gets around, and you smelled something foul in the air, and it smelled like something died, you would just say that, we shouldn't go this way. It smells like something bad is up ahead of us. It would just think that you are able to do some sort of magic. But in actuality, you are just able to see different types of patterns that it can't. And the types of information that we are able to see is restricted to our dimensional domain. We perceive reality via 3 dimensions. All of the information that we are able to interpret as being real is confined to these 3 dimensions. Everything else is considered to be theoretical or hypothetical. That is the general consensus. But the critical point here is that this dimension isn't cut off or separate from any other. They all exist in a continuum. I talked about this in another video that within relativity, it's called the SpaceTime Continuum, where 3D space sort of merges with time. All information, patterns, if you want to call them frequencies, you could say that they all sort of vibrate across all dimensions. And we are only able to see this vibration in certain phases. And the fact that we all more or less come out of the box with the same equipment or hardware, this is how we are able to correlate and communicate with each other. It's sort of like the example with the brain that if it had a mouth and nose and was able to taste the hamburger or the lemon like you, it would know these words sour and bitter. It would make complete and perfect sense. But what I believe is that evolution obviously isn't that simple. There are people who are born without certain senses, people who are born without eyes or blind or deaf. And I believe that there are people who are born with some sort of ability to access different domains of information. And the same way that you trying to explain what red is to a blind person, when these people say certain things, it just doesn't make any sense to us. And where all of this connects to the spiritual symbology is that I think that there are certain people that are talented who can make it make as much sense to us as possible. And this is primarily done via symbology and storytelling. I've talked about storytelling previously on this channel. Our propensity to tell stories is some sort of unique human dynamic. It is some sort of natural frequency that we all respond to, such as music. I've broken all of this down in a previous video, which I'll have on the screen, but stories is some sort of way that we deal with hyperdimensional information. And what I mean by this is, there was a point in our ancestral history before language. If I went into the forest to pick berries and no one saw me, there would simply be no way for no one to know what happened. But by me being able to say that I went to this particular area to pick berries, you now have access to a new dimension, this domain of the past. I can talk to you about the future. And there is something about the way that stories are structured that we just naturally are able to interpret and have make sense. And when I say stories, I'm not talking about a storybook, even down to basic sentence structure. It has a beginning, middle, and end. There is a subject and a predicate. Even something as simple as I went to the store is a story. You have the exposition with I, you have the rising action with went to, and then you have the resolution of store. And these mini story arcs, you can combine them with larger story arcs into a paragraph. You can make those paragraphs into an entire structure of this big convoluted web of information that is ultimately conveying some sort of meaning. It's not coincidental that that is very similar to how math operates. When you look at algebra, you can look at some pretty advanced algebraic expressions, different mathematical expressions, and they can appear to be rather simple, but they are embedded with all of these odd symbols. However, these odd symbols are representations of these enormous arrays of different functions, variables. It has all been condensed into this one letter, this one odd symbol. Because at the end of the day, math is a language. The same way if you are viewing a story, you can have one character that represents all of these underlying things. You can have a character that represents the hero, but what a hero is all of these supporting details. And with all of this in mind, you can see we are in this enormous ecosystem, this giant sea of information and patterns. You are constantly drowning in it. You are surrounded by these symbols. You can walk outside and hear all sorts of commotion and birds chirping, but you have no idea what they are saying. We just sort of know that they are communicating. At our level of understanding, this is what it means to us. But as I mentioned, that information is sort of like the Russian doll toy. There is compressed information that is within information, and there are all of these different levels of understanding, and we are only at this human level. There are types of information that we are completely unaware of. For example, you can take a field of flowers, a field of colorful flowers. To us, those colors are the flowers signifying perhaps to bees, other insects, other birds. We view it as an organism to organism level because this is the level that we are on. We are all just human animals. But just like the Russian doll, if you were to compress this field of flowers from a different perspective, this could be some sort of symbol. It's like a double entendre. That's why it's called double, because you could look at it from either angle and it still makes sense. You could just look at it at a surface level and it still makes sense. But if you have this added layer of understanding, you also get to enjoy this hidden meaning, this meaning within a meaning. A more relatable example, perhaps you are in some sort of server room. You know, there are all of these computers. If you've ever been inside of a server room, when you walk in, you can hear certain buzzing, clicking, and whirring. And if you are tech savvy, you can probably decipher, various things are communicating, various switches and relays are activating. But there is another level to that information. There is another Russian doll that information is nested within. And if you had, super hearing, ultra instinct, if you had some sort of higher perspective, you wouldn't just hear random whirring and buzzing. All of those noises are correspondent to some other stimulus. Everything that you are hearing makes complete and perfect sense. And with some other form of perception, it would sound like something else. It would sound like some other meaningful situation. This is something that obviously we really can't understand. You would sort of speak server room. You would speak computer. And my belief on what's taking place with all of this far out religious symbology is people trying to make sense out of hyperdimensional information. It's kind of like the literary version of a zip file. Or another way of looking at it, there is a famous example that was used about dimensions that if you as a 3D perceiver, you perceive 3 dimensions and you are looking at some sort of 2D character. If you decided to reach your hand down into that world and pull that character up out of that 2D universe into yours, and you just lifted it up and let it go, what would that 2D character see? A common mistake is that people think the 2D character would now be able to see in 3D like you. But I believe the contrary, that this 2D character would just be seeing a 2D version of this new 3D world. It doesn't have the faculties to perceive in 3D. It didn't evolve to be that way. Its entire makeup is based on 2D. And for it to suddenly be thrust into this new world, things just wouldn't make sense. It would see all sorts of things that just shouldn't be able to happen. And after you let it go and this 2D character was falling back down to its 2D reality, things would just make more and more sense until it landed back where it was in its 2D universe that it is evolved to live in. But how would it be able to explain this experience to anyone else? It saw things that it can't even describe because it just doesn't make sense in 2D world language. This is where art and storytelling come in. At least that's how it works for us. That these far out visions, if you want to call them that, they are some sort of representation of something that took place that was just on some other plane. However, these are just interpretations. They are some sort of relaying of information in a way that somewhat makes sense to us, that we can somewhat understand. They aren't literal. And I think a good example of this is what I have up on the screen, Gabriels Horn. This is something that we can only conceptualize mathematically in this realm of immaterial ideas because it does not make sense within our 3D universe because it involves infinity. For all intents and purposes, this is a hyperdimensional object. And if you were to somehow access some other plane and see it, the only way that you could describe it when you came back would be like some sort of horn. I am, of course, referring to the time period of these visions, these prophets. You know, this is probably the most common item that looked like this. Perhaps in today's language, someone would say they saw ice cream cones or gnome hats. My main point is all of this divine, if you want to call it divinity, all of this information is something that we cannot comprehend. And these words that we use, such as angels, such as horns, is us trying to use our language, use what we have at our disposal to try and describe something that just simply doesn't make sense in our universe. Or to put it all simply, everything about these other planes, all language used is metaphor. All language, period, is metaphor. This is why this figure of Christ, Jesus, whenever he would talk about the kingdom of heaven, it had to be in a parable. It was always phrased as the kingdom of heaven is like this. It will be like that. Because if he actually opened his mouth and showed you or told you what it was like, it would just sound like complete nonsense gobbledygook. You sort of see it with the transfiguration of the Christ, that this is an event that takes place within scripture that there isn't any descriptive language to it. It is just something that is described as transcendent, far out. It cannot be explained. And within, for example, the book of Revelations, there is all of this cryptic, symbolic language used. And this obviously is some sort of metaphor for something extremely far out. I often look at it as there is some other domain, plane, or dimension that sort of protrudes into this one. There is some sort of dissolution of boundaries between this domain and another one. And there are common descriptors used, such as horns, for example. Within Christianity, it is, Gabriel is a common candidate for the angel that blows the horn. Within Islam, it's the angel Israfil. But there is this common motif of this horn structure. And obviously, I don't think that we're going to hear a literal horn tooting. But what's actually going to happen is just way more far out than that. This is obviously some sort of hyperdimensional object that sort of hits us over the top of the head, and what that actually means, we cannot comprehend. But this is something that I am continually going to talk about and investigate on the members platform. I already have a video there where I sort of talk about and dissect these types of things. So if you are interested in that, consider supporting the channel. If you found the video interesting, like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, y'all have a blessed day.